Alberta. We are doing the Art of Move podcast. The Art of Move is Dr. Will's personal brand of movement methodology that you can find him on Instagram at The Art of Move. And this podcast is going to dive deep into all manners of functional training, of biomechanics, and of just the body in general. We're going to go over different training methodologies and tell you what we think of it. We'll break down some videos, and you can watch this podcast live on nofilter.net with me and Dr. Will, or you can listen to the replays on Spotify and other major podcasting platforms when they become available. I'm really, really excited to start this because I've been going on a personal journey of revamping how my training has sort of looked and understanding different things about the body and biomechanics. Dr. Will has been a huge part of that, and I will I'll herefor to refer to you as just Will instead of Dr. Will every time I talk about you, man. But how you doing today?
Either one works.
So, Will, like we're doing this podcast mostly because I feel, at least I'm doing this podcast because I feel there's not enough discussion about the realities of biomechanics within training. I think a lot of training right now is based on a methodology that moves within one plane of movement, and we don't address the actual functionality of the human body in mainstream popularized training. It's a lot of sort of bodybuilding, Olympic lifting, powerlifting mentality that's sort of adapted itself. Even the term functional fitness has sort of been appropriated by the Crossfit methodology, and there's not a really clear definition of what functional fitness is. I think the Art of Move has a really cool opportunity to sort of bring more mainstream voice to something that isn't mainstream right now.
Yeah, I think it's about time it's happening. There's a lot of people with movement practices, and the movement practices to me are intentional pattern training, intentional movements of your joints, and seeing what happens exactly at the joint and the behavior you want from those joints. This is opposed to what's happening now, which is go to the gym, sweat, hustle, grow the muscles. So there's a big focus on the muscles, and the joints are left behind. It's all encompassing. It should be one way of going about it. Joints first, muscles second. Your joints wear down before anything else. Okay. So training patterns and training each articulation, how it's designed to move, is very important. Okay. And we're missing that. Even from a young age, we kind of get off that train and go straight into lifting heavy external objects, lifting weights.
Yeah.
So
a lot of, I remember listening to guys like Elliot Hulse who talked about, you shouldn't be lifting. And Elliot Hulse is like a strong man. He's moving big weights. He's deadlifted, 500-600 pounds. And he's in that camp of, heavy lifts. But he also would say to his followers that say, before you can control your body in a calisthenics sort of capacity, you have basically before you can control your body, you have no business trying to control objects and weights outside of yourself. Is that similar to what you're saying, or are you getting even more granular with that?
That's one level of it, right? Because we all come from the lens of lifting. Okay, lifting solves everything. Okay, you go to the gym, you lift weights, that will solve your problems, right? Your injury, potential future injuries. The barbell is the prescription at this point, right? But really your body just sees it as lifting external objects. But you have to be with your body 24/7. The amount that you're lifting external objects is very, very minuscule compared to you being with your body and having to move it the way it was designed to move. And we can look at the joints and say they're designed to move this way, not this way. So let's move them more like they're designed to move. Has nothing to do with weights or anything else, although you can use weights for some of the implementations.
Okay, so in that case, like what role do you think, if we're trying to say that the weightlifting mentality is maybe a misguided one, right? The notion of, I'm gonna just like say a handful of popular lifts would be like squatting, deadlifting, bench pressing, and pull-ups. And what you're saying is maybe those lifts don't necessarily respect the natural function of the joint, right? The natural patterning of the joint, and we're training is
I mean, we're getting right into the nitty gritty here, right? Like those are the lifts that everybody does. And I can come out and say, don't do them, but that's not the case. If you want to get better at weightlifting, lift weights, okay? And there's a advantage to knowing how to lift. You should be a master at lifting, okay? And know how to do it and have a amazing awareness of where your body is in space as it's lifting, okay? All that's valuable. And there is value in weightlifting, but it's not intentional pattern training, and it's not intentionally moving the joints as they're designed to move. I'm walking and running, or I should just say walking, because everybody does that. Even an office worker, 10,000 steps a day, that's what you're doing the most. The amount of times that you put a barbell on your back or heavy weight on your back and squat up and down hundreds of times in real life, it just doesn't happen, okay? Maybe in the past where you were a farmer or something, you had to lift extremely heavy weight, but now that's done with a machine. Okay, so I should be able to lift a relatively heavy amount of weight and do it safely with an object. Like I would rather use an Atlas stone versus a barbell, because that's actually how I would carry a box if I'm moving it.
Right.
Okay? So there is value in it. I'm not saying there's not, but intentional pattern training is the key. Be better at moving, not lifting external objects. From up until now, there hasn't been a solid way to look at this, I believe, okay? Because the way we look at things, as a professional therapist, chiropractor, you're trained to look at the studies, and the studies are the truth. The consensus of the study is the truth in movement. But now people are saying, wait a second, we have slow motion. We can watch the movement happen amongst different populations. We're talking, elderly people, kids, pro athletes, and we can see the commonalities between those movements at every joint. Then we can perfect them and say, this movement behavior is better than this one. So let's try to train to that behavior that's better. And it's not always done with barbells. It's infrequently done with just barbells or dumbbells or a gym. It's looking at the joint and say, what can you do with it? And what can't you do with it? Do you have control of it, both dynamically and statically? Okay. So yeah, that's pretty much.
So let's use the hips are like a pretty heavily debated complex of joints, right? And a lot of people will say, squatting and deadlifting will translate to a faster sprint time, not necessarily because you're directly training the pattern of sprinting. Because if you look at the patterning of sprinting, there is that torque that happens through the upper body in the midsection. Your hips are rotating, and it's a bilateral movement, it's a unilateral movement as opposed to a deadlift and a squat, which are bilateral movements, right? So is that with this mentality of heavy deadlifting and heavy squatting, is that misguided? Should you train the patterning of squatting of sprinting more directly, or is there actually a benefit or a use of these heavy barbell movements, even though they're bilateral or unilateral movement?
That's an amazing question, and I could go on all day with that. But it comes down again to, are you training the pattern? A bilateral lift, you stuck to the ground, lifting with 2 feet, okay, versus running full tilt like this is not the same thing. Your muscles are going at different lengths. Your joints are dynamically in motion during a run. It's static when you're lifting. You're in one plane of motion the whole time. That is not what happens in reality. So there's only so much translation you can have between the two. Now, the thought process has been, let's put giant engines on athletes, okay? And yeah, if I get bigger glutes, I could probably put more power out of that glute. But am I rotating my hip in socket properly? So the hip and the shoulder are ball and socket technology. They must be treated like such. There is a rotation that happens in the joint. This rotation is not the same between squatting and running. This should be common sense, okay? Like I can look at the two exercises and say, they are different. Okay, I can logically look at my eyes and see that. But you know what? I was trained that the squat is king, to do assessments with the squat. So I know where that thought process comes from, right? But when you deeper dive into it, you can actually say, hey, we can break down the mechanics of sprinting now much more easily than before, because we are relying on slow motion to actually look at it frame by frame, not just guessing with theory. Okay, so on one hand, the papers are good, the science is good, right? But there's problems with it. And the problem is that movement specifically, you have to actually look at it. I have to see the behavior happen in real time. The only way to do that, and the best way to do it, is slow motion, period. Okay, it's not guesswork, it is reality. That's why the NFL uses it. That's why the NBA uses it. That's why tennis uses it. Our eye is not that good at seeing things. So slow motion reigns supreme. If science wants to participate in that, because there's a divide right now between, people who are saying, like GOATA is saying, look at the slow motion. Scientists are like, yeah, but where's your paper? Yeah. I think the scientists literally have to adapt because of the nature of movement. Science must adapt slow motion or get left in the dust.
So you just mentioned GOATA, and for people who don't know who GOATA is an organization that stands for the greatest of all time actions, or the greatest of all time athletes. And basically what they've done is they've based their entire methodology around viewing slow motion footage of some of the greatest athletes who stayed injury free for most of, if not all of their career, indigenous populations whose movement is natural and untouched by sort of the marrings of modern society, like sitting for hours a day at a desk or on a couch, people who maintained their indigenous ability to sit in a resting squat. And they watched these walking, crawling, running patterns in slow motion and sort of determined that, hey, look, these are the patterns that promote the most longevity in the joints, the most sort of resilience in connective tissue. And they're very controversial because a lot of them say that doing something like a deadlift would be what they call reverse gear technology. As in, if you're mid deadlift and you let go of the bar, you're flying backwards. Meanwhile, if you watch every slow motion video, a human being is meant to travel forward. So they kind of have a proprietary method of training forward locomotion as their principal means of what they call human training. But they're controversial because they go against, very popular methodologies that involve barbell training. They, like you said, they don't have scientific papers. And the limitation that I'm seeing in a lot of science, and a lot of exercise science in particular, is that it comes from that first principles bias of lifting, of using external loads. And it's measuring things like, sprint times, but also hypertrophy and power output on these machines or in a barbell capacity. And they don't take into account some of the dynamic aspects of human movement as humans were, quote, meant to move.
Absolutely. There's a lot that you said that we can go to. Basically with GOATA, I'm always looking for different movement ideas. Okay, this is something I think about all day. Very interesting to me. I've looked at functional patterns. If you don't know what that is, what I got from them is to use your sling systems, use your fascia in an elastic manner. That's great. Okay, I still wasn't finding what I was looking for in terms of gait analysis. The gait analysis that's done in like an academic circle is looking at how many steps you take. So cadence, how fast, how long they are, how high does your hip go, how fast does your leg drive back, what part of your foot hits the ground, is it a heel or is it a forefoot? That's as far as it goes. And to me, that wasn't satisfactory. It's looking at slow motion, and to be honest, they hardly even look at slow motion when they're looking at gait analysis. So as soon as I saw GOATA say, no, we have to bring it back to the foundation. Let's look at how their feet are pivoting, what part of the foot they're landing on. Is the hip doing the proper motion inside the socket. Okay, so if you start breaking movement down into its components, you can see the behavior happen right in front of your eyes. This is much better than anything else. So GOTA is the first one to use slow motion that I've seen that break it down in a systematic way, a checklist that says this is the behavior you should have and this isn't the behavior you should have. Right. Then as soon as we have the proper behaviors, you can start loading that behavior, which is another subject. They move weight forward, not up and down, which is what I would do, okay? But in either case, you're learning to move your joints and your body the way it was designed to move, and you look at yourself in slow motion, and it's, if the slow motion is saying something, it's not lying. The eye in the sky never lies. The slow motion is telling the truth. So that's why I think GOTA is the top dog of the, you know, I guess they're not mainstream, but the underground movement.
Functional training subculture.
For sure. And functional training could be everyone claims functional training, right? So that's a word that's just way too loaded right now, because CrossFit's functional training, bodybuilding is now functional training, powerlifting is functional training, gymnastics is functional training.
And technically, you are training a function in each of those methodologies, right? Like you are training the function of muscle contraction in bodybuilding, you're training the function of force output with powerlifting, you're, you know, everything that you have, you're training, you know, range of motion in gymnastics and balance in gymnastics, and these are all functions. But the question is, like, what are the native functions of human beings? And I think
what are the priorities?
Yeah. So if you were to define or prioritize different levels of function within, because you know, when you talked about what the mainstream is focused on, which is the size of the muscle, one of the things that you've talked about that really made me think about the body in a different way was that we have different systems. We have the muscular system, we have a respiratory system, we have a lymphatic system, we have a nervous system. We have these different systems that make up the ultimate system of the human body. So when you're thinking about prioritizing, you know, different movement patterns, or what would you prioritize, I guess, in a more simple way to put it, what would you prioritize in functional training?
Yeah, that depends. So as a therapist, I have the opportunity to see someone's history and, you know, work with that, right? So they have previous injuries and we can dive into that. So that's a whole different story. But for the masses, if I don't have a chance to see you personally, okay, I would first do an assessment to see a slow motion assessment and get that done by somebody who knows what they're doing, right? Because that'll give you the real reason that power is leaking through your body or why you're not working your joints properly. Okay. And almost everybody has some sort of kink they need worked out, unless you're Michael Jordan. Okay. The priority for me is staying within what your joints are designed to do. As soon as you move out of the design, GOTA would call it moving out of the math. Okay. Then you're in trouble. So an easy example is, where are you putting pressure on your foot to take off? So as soon as I pretend this is my big toe, pretend this is my pinky, right? If I'm taking off from this, if I'm going like this and pressing into the ground and taking off like this, then it's going to be a problem at my ankle, problem at my knee, problem at my hip. Times that by 10,000 every single day, and you have yourself a major issue over a period of years. Okay, just from moving outside of how the joints were designed to move. GOTA, and this is what I believe now, is you can take the foot and the ankle and you have to get those right, because if those aren't right, you're starting, and that's what hits the earth first. If you don't get those right, then the rest can't be right. Okay, and that's just looking at it from one end, because you can look at it from the other end as well, which is the spine moving. Okay, does the spine move correctly as you're walking? And that's tilting from side to side, which again doesn't jive with mainstream theory, with the scientific theory on this one, because the scientific theory, and you can Google this, is the spine is a passive column. It's supposed to stay dead straight, and it's just going along for the ride.
Well, and that's sort of when you do a lot of barbell training, it's like the neutral spine, the brace of the core, you know, any powerlifting movement with a deadlift, it's like you're not supposed to have any flexion or extension, let alone, you know, rotation or torque while you're doing a deadlift, right?
And that's a great example, because that's everything has to be looked at, because when you have a hammer, everything's a nail. So in my past, let's say 5 years ago, you'd ask me that same question, right? Or bring upon that same thought. I would look at it in my brain. I'd go, okay, what can the barbell do to fix this? Okay, versus look at the particular joint and see the behavior at the joint. So again, when you have a hammer, everything's a nail. The barbell will fix everything. And that's just not the case. The behavior has to be specific. If you don't have the right behavior, if it's outside the math, or just call it, if your energy is leaking from a joint because it's not in the right angle, it's going to be a problem up the chain. So you want your movement to be perfect first. And then, and within the math, okay, and we'll define what that is later, but stay in the proper planes of motion, and your joints will reap the benefit of having the connective tissue in a state where it doesn't break down. That's basically it.
So I find this really interesting, right? Because GOATA's sort of central topic seems to be, it's like pattern yourself with the right biomechanics, essentially. Like their quote within the math, they have this like sort of Fibonacci idea that your foot spirals and your hip spiral and your body spirals and everything spirals in this sort of predictable way. And if you do that, you have less tissue damage. And one of the main criticisms that I've heard about this is that, well, that's great, that's ideal, but in life, say if you're running on an uneven surface, you're not going to be able to maintain an inside ankle bone high position, which is one of their positions that they say is like ideal. Sometimes your foot will flex in, and you will have a you know, an alternate sort, like you basically, this is
that.
What's that?
They don't deny that though.
No. And I find that interesting, right? Like there's so the ground up idea of like you start with your feet. I studied with the Athletic Truth Group for a while, which is like Ben Patrick, who's Kneesovertoesguy, if you want a more popular tagline. And one of his things was, you know, he wanted to build knee resiliency because he had these knee surgeries. And his first line of defense when he was helping people rehab these horrible knee issues where they couldn't run, they could barely walk, he would get people to do tibialis raises. He says, you know, basically if you have a strong tibialis, which is the front part of your shin, then you can absorb more impact. That's your, he said, he called it the first line of defense too, right? It's the first thing that hits the ground. So if you have strong tibialis, strong calves, then those muscles and those tendons are going to absorb that force more effectively. I found that was pretty interesting. I did that methodology for close to 8 months. You know, I did Lucas Aaron's range of strength training, and then I did about 6 months of Ben Patrick's different programs.
So how about we do this? I challenge the, like, I like debating, right? Because that's how ideas get through. There's no, I'm going to challenge your ideas with it. Okay. So you probably know more about this system than me, although I've looked at quite a bit of it online. Okay. So, is ATG what you're mentioning, the systems where they say, you know, you have to have the ankle range of motion and tibialis is going to stop your foot from coming down. Okay. That's fine. Okay. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. The burden of proof is on them to say that that's true. If you want to put burdens of proof onto GOATA, you also have to do it onto other methodologies as well. It's harder to do when you're hot. Ben Patrick is hot right now. Nobody would challenge the system in the right mind. Okay, that's outside the you know, the fitness world. Okay, or the club, I guess you can say. So my view on it is are they in a rotary mentality? Do they acknowledge that the foot is supposed to hit the outside edge and the heel is supposed to turn away as a pivot when you hit the ground? Is that a thing that they talk about?
So, this is, I do recognize there's a lot of limitations within the ATG system, which is fundamentally why I stopped doing it. I kind of, I wanted to absorb as much as I could from them and then explore other methodologies, because they're very, I find any system that becomes a system fundamentally has limitations because it only looks within the system, typically. Right? And so ATG's sort of core idea, as far as I understood, was develop strength through range and condition your tendons and your ligaments and your muscular system. So they're training the tendinal system, they're training range of motion and strength within different ranges, so that you would have resilience when your body was eventually pushed into. Now, did they talk about specific running biomechanics? No, they were very joint isolation focused.
So like FRC, functional range conditioning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very,
okay.
very.
And you know what? I do that type of training as well. Okay. Very little of it, but I do. I understand the value of making your tendons stronger, more resilient, and you can, just like anything else, progressively overload the tendon, which is what they're doing. Okay. And making the tissue stronger. That is great. I do that in rehab. But are they respecting the math? Are they respecting the rotary system? Are they respecting the spinal engine as you move? From the maneuvers I've seen them do, they don't. So that is my criticism of the system. They're not embracing what we see in the slow motion, okay, for the most part. Now, within the ATG system, I see that there's a big emphasis on the end range of your muscles. Like, let's say they're doing the pec, they're going to go to the end range and like really work that end range. That's fantastic. Okay. Like, that's great stuff. You're going to work your tissues, much like a functional range conditioning. You're going to strengthen your tissues in the end range. All that is gravy. But if you don't respect the math, if you're landing inside ankle bone low, if you're dumping in on the inside of your foot, you're building a faulty foundation. Let's say you're going to be able to mitigate the problems a little longer, but the problem's still going to come. Okay. And that is my assertion there. I can't prove it with any science. Okay. But I'm looking at the systems, and I believe the spinal engine, the fact that your spine moves from side to side, to be true. What ATG does not embrace this, not from what I've seen. Neither does FRC, neither does functional patterns does now. The only ones that I see embracing it are Weckmethod, functional patterns, and GOTA.
Well, because I think those three systems that you talked about are the only ones that are thinking in terms of a movement patterning approach, as opposed to like a strengthening approach, right? And the strengthening approach typically happens within a sagittal plane, right? So that box movement, like you said, it's like when you're asking, well, does Ben Patrick respect the fact that, we have to keep the inside ankle bone high and we pivot off and we kind of do that spiral movement on the foot? No, he's doing lunges. He's doing long lunges coming up onto the toe, and he's not thinking about the angle of his foot when he comes forward. He's not talking about any of that, essentially. And it's interesting because I knew the ATG system pretty well after about 6 months of studying it and being part of their group and looking at their programs. And then I got really into GOTA, and I got really into those things. And I tried to combine the two methods, and it was really, really interesting. I actually found that with the ATG system, my knees, when I was doing other basic movements, started to hurt. And I was like, well, isn't the whole point to have knee resiliency? And so I was like, well, that's really weird. But then I kind of like watched back videos of when I was doing some of this method, and I was like, okay, if the GOTA guys are right, then everything that I'm doing should be causing tissue degeneration as well. Even if I'm strengthening, I didn't have any pain in the ranges that I was training. But then when I was doing other things, it was like, why do my knees kind of hurt when I'm walking around? Like I've never experienced this before. Like, I'm super strong in these end ranges, but my knees kind of hurt when I'm walking around.
Tell me if this is the case. If you were to, because I know in ATG, or this is how I think it works, you kind of get a coach when you sign up for it, and you can ask them questions. Is that true?
Not really. Not really. So the way the ATG system works, I was doing ATG for coaches.
Yeah.
So because I wanted to learn how I could train other people in the methodology, and I wanted to hear what results other coaches were getting, basically what it is they teach you the methods and why they work. And you go through the programs yourself. And once you reach a certain level of proficiency within the certain program, then you progress to the next program and you take their lessons, and they have a very rich library of different information about their training methodology. The thing that I was most excited for about the ATG system was to learn some of the physiological reasons why their method worked, and they didn't have any. And that was the thing that kind of disappointed me the most, was they talked about tendonal training and ligament training, but they didn't talk much about kinesiology or biomechanics or any of that in any of their lessons. As far as I understood, it was very, very minimal information and more just saying, hey, do this and this is the result you'll get, right? And
so I think there's a common sense there, though, that like if you load a tissue and just keep progressively loading it, the specific adaptation to impose demands, which is a biological principle that everybody kind of adheres to. You'll hear Naudi, Aguilar say it all the time, and it's true. Your body specifically adapts to what you do. So if you slowly get to that range, I'm going to give you a specific example. When you're doing that board descend, the single leg squat descend on the board, where you're working your knee. If you go down by 1 millimeter every day, you should be able to progress to go further down in their system, right? But again, it's not respecting the math. It's like if you're supposed to be training inside ankle bone high and having the weight on the outside of your foot, the strong side, that takes priority over going lower and lower. Now, just like FRC, functional range conditioning, which most athletes know, taking a joint to the end range and working articulations, like I always do this with my shoulder just to get some fluid in there. Okay?
Yeah.
And that's great stuff. That's keeping the joint as a baseline healthy. Okay, but I think it's taken to another level where you can have better outcomes and prioritize other things for better gains. And the gains are intentional movement patterns that you can have for the rest of your life.
Right.
Barbell training ends, strength training ends, Olympic lifting ends, powerlifting ends at some point in your 50s. Okay, no matter how much you want to do it, and you have those anomalies every once in a while, but for the most part, people are done with it because they can't keep going. GOTA and intentional training of your joints can happen till the day you die, and you can make gains.
In theory, right? Like we haven't seen it. Hasn't been around long enough to see the 80, 90-year-old people.
We can watch the 80 or 90-year-olds move in the track and field world championships, and you can, like, I've spent enough time watching down the street right now, the people who are walking well. So this is anecdotal, but I'm seeing it now. I'm seeing, okay, that your endurance durable if you're GOTA. Like my dad's a truck driver. He's extremely GOTA. And he doesn't have any of the ailments that any truck driver had. And he was a truck driver for 35 years. And I always wondered, I'm like, okay, this guy never hit the gym. He's doing a seated job and he can move really well. I'm like, what is going on? And then I looked at him with a different lens and I'm like, oh, he's walking GOTA. He's like endurance durable. He's almost 70, never worked out, played sports. And I remember him climbing trees when he was in his 50s. And okay, I see the pattern. And I'm seeing it all over the place now. So I can't deny it.
So one of the groundwork things that I'd like to do for people listening is kind of set the foundation for what the joints are kind of meant to do. Right now, I have the long head tendon of my bicep torn, and I actually am going to need surgery for that in the next 3 months because I tore my bicep tendon right out of my labrum doing an Olympic lift, so a snatch, so that internal rotation overhead position ripped my bicep tendon. I need surgery for it now, right? So this was sort of what sent me on that personal path to figure out, okay, well, what's the actual function of the shoulder joint? Because it's obviously not to rip a ton of weight in this incredibly internally rotated position to externally and lock it out overhead. Like some people can develop, again, a lot of the end range training that I was doing was so that I could,
that, but it's not its primary function.
No, right? It's not. it's not fundamentally meant to do that necessarily, right? So what I'd like to do with you quickly is to go through each of the joints and kind of talk about what are the natural function. I know functional patterns, we talked about Naudi Aguilar a little bit. He says the functional patterns big four are standing, walking, running, and throwing.
I'd agree with that. I'd absolutely agree with that.
Instead of squatting, pressing, pulling, and hinging, right? Like that's like so that's you have gym culture, which are the primary movements: press, pull, squat, hinge. And Naudi's saying functional patterns is saying stand, walk, run, throw.
So think about this. Your intention as somebody who says the primary functions are hinging, squatting, lunging, and pulling, pushing. Those are simple movements. So if you master them, you're mastering simple movements. You will get simple movements in real life. If you want to be someone who can hinge really well with heavy weight, do that. But we're talking if running, throwing, sprinting, I would even put cutting into that. Because sprinting straight line is much different than moving in 3 dimensions. Okay? So I wouldn't exactly make the standard straight line running, but that's the easiest way to assess it. Okay? Actually, let's go back to your shoulder example and see what each of the systems would say about that shoulder and where I agree and disagree with it. Okay? So you're coming overhead, you're going like that. Okay? Those shoulders flipping up like this. Now, in my reality, okay, if I'm going to go punch, because striking is one of the things that I would say is prioritizing. It's a lot like throwing. So grasping, striking, and throwing are the shoulder motions that I would say were designed to do most. Okay, and running, like running, as I'm running, my shoulder's moving as well. Okay, so that's 4 functions we've seen. Now, when you're going overhead like this, is it respecting the fact that usually you're turning your body as you're moving your shoulder? So what I'm saying is if I go overhead, I'd want to turn my body to go with it. There's always that motion. When I go to grab something, I'm never like this.
Right.
Ever in real life, but we're doing it in Olympic lifting. So it's missing the fact that there can be a rotation within the shoulder as you're lifting. GOTA would say that. You're missing the corner. You're not cornering. You don't corner enough, and corner is where it takes a turn. My shoulder's turning. So when I'm striking, I'm cornering every time. That's why you rarely see martial artists hurt their shoulder, even though they're striking thousands and thousands and thousands, 100,000 times.
Because there's that rotation within the movement. So I'm almost doing the opposite or the wrong type of rotation in a snatch. And I mean, I can even feel it in this shoulder that I need surgery on. When I come up here, it clicks when I transition from those positions. I can actually feel where the bicep tendon tore in that position.
So FRC, functional range conditioning, which is another popular one. And I want to talk deep here, right? So we're going to go for the audience that is deep into this. Functional range conditioning would say, wait a second, you don't have any business going overhead in a snatch if you can't slowly articulate your joint in its range of motion in a slow and controlled manner. Since you didn't assess that on yourself probably, then you have no business going overhead at speed. Okay, and this applies to most people. Most people's shoulders are kind of messed up. Okay, I know that from a therapist seeing thousands of patients. Now, it's not respecting the cornering according to GOTA. Functional range conditioning says we don't really care about the cornering, or we don't even know about the cornering.
Right.
Okay, just make sure the joint articulates in its socket. I say go one level.
I was sitting there and I was training like with a dumbbell, and I'm doing those external rotations. Maybe I have a band and I'm training my external rotation.
Yeah.
And I'm slowly articulating that joint
Sure.
over time, that I can condition that joint to be able to be resilient enough to do that pattern.
That's a rehab theory right there.
Right.
That's to me, that's very basic. It's like that's like me doing this. I do this, 20 times a day just to get the fluid in the shoulder. That's about as much importance that I put on it. I'm worried about my behavior as I move. I'm supposed to corner the shoulder. The shoulder has to corner. My rotation of my thoracic spine has to go. The scapula has to go, the shoulder blade, and the ball has to go in the socket. And that's the type of behavior I want. Circular patterns. doesn't wear down your joints.
What you're doing there looks like almost like a swimming, like a front crawl swimming stroke where you insert and then straighten out.
Try to swim with this type of motion. How are you going to want to do this? Okay, this is like a dancer. Imagine a dancer doing this. You always bring in rhythm. A boxer never goes like this. It's always in rhythm, movement. The corner of the shoulder is very important. It has to go around. So it doesn't matter what you want. It's what the shoulder is designed to do. If you want to go overhead period, or like over and over and over again in a snatch, your shoulder is going to wear down. Sorry. Maybe snatch, because you're in a sport. Okay, the sport dictates that that's the parameters of what you have to do. However, if I'm an amateur, I say, hey, you know what? Instead of a snatch, I'm going to do a dumbbell and press it up overhead with the corner. Instead of doing a barbell bench press, which is the same problem. You're anchoring your thoracic spine and the shoulder's taking all the heat and your, a collarbone and all that. I used to bench a lot. I have a lot of problems in the joints here, which I've learned to mitigate, but ask me 3 years ago, I'd have inflammation all over the place, bench pressing in the upper threes, right? I used to be into powerlifting. Basically, I forgot to corner my shoulder. So if I'm going to do anything, it's going to be a movement with that in mind, okay? Not this.
Yeah. You're not working in this fixed range of motion that doesn't respect the fact that our upper body has to rotate. And then that, when people say, okay, so for people who are just listening, we're giving visual demonstrations on the platform right now where you can actually see us moving. But the idea of cornering would be, rather than kind of moving in a straight line, your fist sort of rotates as you, so come into the position of a bench press if you want to try this for yourself, and sort of twist your fists so that they face up in that bottom position. If you press forward, you're rotating your fists in, and that sort of emulates a sort of cornering action within your shoulder joint. When we say corner, it's almost like a rotation as you press.
Yes, it's a rotation of not only the shoulder, but a coordination of the thoracic spine. And we can go down the chain because it really starts at your foot, but you'll see it happen at the thoracic spine, at the scapula, the shoulder blade, and at the actual shoulder joint itself. When those are in harmony and synchronicity, that's when your shoulder will not take any load. But again, it's the math. It's how you have to respect the joint, because that's how it's designed to move in full reality 3D. You can see the complex movements I do on, on Instagram and all that, and they respect this pattern. That's why I'm not getting hurt. I was always hurt when I was bench pressed, or when I bench pressed and when I did heavy weights, because I didn't know about these principles. I didn't have it all together, and I was working off the wrong mat.
Right.
Okay? Now that also, on a higher level, there is elasticities to the joints. So your pec, let's say, as an easy example, although again, the sling systems, the elasticity of your muscles isn't a singular muscle thing, it's a full body thing. So imagine you have an elastic across your whole body, and your joints actually work in that elasticity. So your brain has to coordinate how much elasticity your tissues have and have an understanding of that. Kinesthetic understanding between your brain and your muscles and fascia of how much stretch you have at the joint. Then you can maximally use those joints as catapults if you know what to do. But again, that's a higher level of training.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because like No Filter Network, which we're doing this podcast on, is a really popular platform for a lot of baseball guys. And I know baseball is one of the most GOTA sport, like sort of GOTA observed sport. You think about the swing, you think about the throw. Whipping a baseball halfway down a baseball field is an example of that pec elasticity and that function of throwing. And then you're sprinting from one base to another. Like every movement that they do, fundamentally, if you want to maximize your efficiency at that sport, you basically have to operate within these functions of elasticity and joint resilience.
Absolutely. And people understand slow motion in football and baseball because people are obsessed with their swings, and golf as well. People are obsessed with their swings. They want them better. Okay, they already know to go to the slow motion. They're like, does a baseball player go, okay, I'm gonna brace my core right before I hit the ball, and that'll make me hit it the farthest. And that theoretical paper that came out from the science world, I'm gonna swing like that. Or do they go to the slow motion and hit and then feel, hit and feel, hit and feel. And then when they get the right feel with the right motion, kinesthetic intelligence, okay, not so much, intellect IQ, although there is that as well, but feeling IQ, that's when they are in sync, in rhythm. And that's the essence of, GOTA and looking at slow motion as the number one thing to look at.
Well, it's funny too. We had 4 former MLB players on a couple of nights ago. We had Will Clark, we had Eric Burns, we had Kevin Youkilis, and Johnny Gomez, and they basically took turns doing exactly that. They were like, I would angle my shoulder like this way, and then that way I could lower my shoulder into the pocket.
You're showing a spiral pattern right now for anybody who's not into the listening to the podcast.
Yeah. So and they broke it down into how they could maximize for me watching and listening to these guys, and like they're literally talking about how they maximize the efficiency of their spiral pattern in their swing, and being able to see it from. I would love for us to get Will Clark on this podcast, for example, because he'll do full demonstrations in his garage about his swing, and you watch him and it's like he's literally showing you how to maximize the efficiency and follow through of this particular spiral pattern.
I would actually love to do that. So here's the thing. If the movement's true, there's no hiding anything, right? We can actually go. That's the great thing about looking at slow motion and GOTA in general is that, and Weckmethod does this too. So I'll give them credit because I like David Weck, and so basically looking at the slow motion and retrying what you did. You know what I mean? That's what I do when I'm learning martial arts. I'll literally slow motion the martial artist. In boxing, I slow motion Mayweather all the time, Canelo, Lomachenko's footwork. I integrate it into my own footwork because I look at the slow motion, I see the behavior, and I just copy it. If you can move like Michael Jordan, you're now moving like Michael Jordan. It's the truth. You now move like him, but you can't because his movement's amazing. But you should be trying to move like Michael Jordan. That should be your, instead of a 405 bench or a 500 squat, you should be trying to move like Michael Jordan. Because in reality, if you can move like Michael Jordan, you are now athletic and you're going to be skipping down the street. You're going to be walking with sway. You're going to be able to move at any point. I can get up right now, like from asleep, and I can go sprint. No problem. Okay, no stretching besides like cat stretching. Like I do a little bit of the, FRC style training where you train the injury position, but I'm talking like 1% of the time. For the most part, I'm trying to keep the behaviors clean as possible in both my nervous system and my musculoskeletal system and joints. Keep the movement clean, get the pattern right, and you will reap the benefit.
So I'm going to talk in terms a little bit of how people periodize their training, right? Because I know I come from the powerlifting background of you would set up different training blocks to hit certain performance markers, and you would cycle through your performance. And one of the things that I sort of had an issue with when adapting some of the more functional pattern orienting training to my actual physical training, as in like my metabolic conditioning, my strength conditioning, was once I have these patterns down, well, how do I program them into an effective training methodology? What percentage? Because you said, you also don't want to throw away some strength training. For example, it's like, okay, maybe I'm lifting a sandbag, or I'm lifting an Atlas stone, or maybe I'm still lifting so that I can master lifting so I can lift safely in real life. Maybe I'm, doing some running because my patterning is good enough, and running is the most natural way for us to condition our movement. Or or move to condition ourselves in terms of cardiovascular capacity, right? As opposed to, sitting hunched over on a bike or getting on an elliptical machine, right?
Sure.
So if you were to, again, we're talking in terms of priorities, not even necessarily in sets and reps and stuff, like, how would you prioritize training once, like, we'll do 3 levels. If someone's an absolute beginner and has pretty poor biomechanics, once someone has pretty decent biomechanics and can start loading them, and then someone who wants to be trained at the highest level of athleticism, how would you program?
Man, that's a loaded question, but I'll give you the general way. Somebody comes in, I see this all the time at the office, like patients. I try to see where their awareness is in their body. Okay. Some people are completely turned off of their body, like the brain and the parts of the body are not connecting, right? So that has to be first. That's where FRC style, like movement of specific motion. So let's take the hip, for example. I'll move the hip in isolation. For those watching, I can do something like this while moving my hip back and forth. Okay, you can see this on my YouTube channel, but I'll isolate the hips. I'll isolate the lumbar spine, thoracic spine, then cervical spine. I'll make sure they can do all the motions of those joints in every plane in a static way, just standing there. Can you do it? And then that progresses to a bent level because that makes it harder to move all those joints. Once you get that, you'll have a baseline understanding of how to move, at least the spine and the hips. Okay, that's where I would start with an older person who isn't trained, who has no awareness of their body. But now I'm saying, yeah, I'll do that too. But I like the basic GOTA positions of bow and corner, standing in the bow and corner and just feeling it out for 30 seconds. I think this is going to give more of a benefit than the FRC style training for like 20 minutes. If I can give a person the understanding of a basic position where you're aligned, your hips are working in the way they're designed to do, and I can get you to stand like that for 30 seconds 5 times a day, I'd rather do that than isolate the joint. Okay, at this point. So that's what I would do.
If I can give an example too, so I still coach at the CrossFit gym a couple times a week, and I started throwing in some of these quote bow and corner movements as part of the warm up. So these people will come in, I'll be like, "How's everyone feeling today?" They're like, "Oh, we're sore. We got really tight hamstrings, really tight glutes. Our lower backs are super sore." They're like, "Okay, cool. Let's do some warm up." And what I'll get them to do is just a little bit of locomotion, where I'll say, "All right, start with your feet hip distance apart. Take a step forward as if you were going to just walk. Now from here, put the weight in your last 2 toes, your pinky toe and your ring toe, and lift your heel off the ground slightly. Rotate your knee out ever so slightly and turn your back, and now lean forward slightly so that you're in your posterior chain." Now, I'll just get them to hold that for a second and then take a step forward. And I'll do that back and forth, to and fro from the gym. And sometimes I'll increase the range of motion. Maybe I'll get them to go in that position and reach for their knee or their shin so that it's stretching out in that position a little bit. They're loading that bow a little bit more.
Yeah,
but
getting them to learn
2 or 3 lengths of that, and all their pain is gone. Like just from doing that.
Very interesting. The only thing, like where I just saw what you did with the bow, don't stick your knee out first. You want to do it from the hip. So the knee and the solar plexus should be pointing in the same direction. Yeah, I want to redo it. I would do the hip first, and that's why the knee points out, not because you rotate at the knee. You know what I mean? So it should be hip dominant.
If I rotate my hip, then my knee actually follows.
Yes.
So what you're saying is I was leading with my knee first and then following with my hip.
Exactly.
You want to do it reverse. So if I turn my hip, now I'm in the position.
Exactly.
And my foot pivots. Then I step.
Yeah, and if exactly. That looks great, right? And that's respecting what happens at the joints when you actually walk ideally, okay? It's hard for me to believe that if you watch somebody walk duck foot down the street, okay, which is almost everybody to some degree. Hardly anybody has straight feet. We're talking, 80% of the population is somewhat walking on the outside of their feet, right? Now, yeah, somewhat like that. Even bring them in a little bit. Yeah, so people are a lot like that, right? And they're doing that. So when you look, your heel's pointed in. Like if I was to draw a line from your heel, they would cross like an X. Now, the problem is that the bone, your shin, so point at your shin right now, your shins are pointed outwards. When you're taking off from a run, the femur has to rotate inwards, right? So as the femur, no. So like on your takeoff leg, your femur has to rotate in. No, so
funny. I've patterned it so much that I can't even do it the wrong way now.
Yeah. Well, what I'm talking about is this: you can't have your femur internally rotating and your tibia and fibula externally rotating. They're going the opposite direction, and that's going to cause torque at the knee, and you're going to have a problem eventually. Not a massive problem when you're not doing any. You're sedentary and you're doing like 5,000 steps a day. Not great, but the wear and tear will take a little longer, but it's going to happen. You have to stay within the math. Your feet, outside edge, go inside ankle bone high and outside edge now. Yeah, no, just in like a stance. You can see that that's much better. It's bowed, and I would go even more ankle bone high if you can. Yeah, so that looks a lot better. And if you walk like that and stay within that code, or stay within that plane, your hips and knees will thank you. It's very simple, right? Simple yet hard because you actually have to change the behavior.
Yeah, like you can just hold this position. Like I'm literally just I'm keeping my feet straight, lifting, putting all the weight in my last two toes, my pinky toe and my ring toe, and then leaning forward just slightly so that I have a little bit more what they call back chain dominance. So it's more forward moving motion. I'm just doing this and my legs are shaking. Like you can train this in isolation, and that's incredible training for your body. You're building the resilience of that pattern, right?
The simplicity of intentional movement training, moving your joints intentionally and working the patterns of locomotion, of walking and running, have your femur spin the proper way as you walk, is the training. It's very simple. It's so simple that it's almost laughable, okay? Because think about this. As you're squatting, okay? Let's see if I can get myself on camera here and actually squat down a little bit. So what I'm saying here, sorry, my camera is, if I can get that down there. Okay, so can't see that yet, eh? Try one more time.
Maybe if you could, but
okay, there we go. Okay, so if I'm squatting, right, and I'm doing that squat where I come down, and I'll even do it on top of the couch here so you can really see. I'm coming down, both my knees are out. Okay, that's the cue that people train, is that knees out position. The problem is, as I'm coming out, my knees are still out. So I'm not outletting that energy from a turn, okay? Where I'm actually, if I'm walking or running, the hip is coming around the corner. So similar problem to the bench press, okay? Or the Olympic lift where everything's staying static here. There's no rotation of the pelvis as I'm doing that up and down squat, okay? So I'm gonna have those problems of the hip. So I'm staying in a bow the whole time. I'm staying with my knees outside the whole time when in fact they're supposed to spin in as I move. So I'm only doing one of the motions, the bow. If I'm squatting, I need to pivot as well. And that is the second part of the movement that's missing in the squat. So you'll actually see it quite a bit in actual Olympic lifters. You know, when they go like this and they're lifting heavy, and at the bottom they go like this with their knees?
Yeah. They're trying to corner, right? So
well, that's the corner naturally happening, the gait cycle naturally happening in the squat. And people, the question has always been, is it more important to keep the knees out. Like, why are the knees coming in? We don't want this, right? Yeah, you don't when you lift, but you do when you or walk and run. So it's
if you were going to take the squat pattern, I'm gonna do a demo, and I'll just show you. In theory, could you do a bow to a corner squat? I'll use the wall, so I'll come down. Can you like those are knees out? As I come up, can I corner? And then that's
absolutely.
So this is more.
Absolutely. That's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah. You see my heels come out because I'm cornering in, right? So I'm cornering from an externally rotated position to an internally rotated position as I come up.
That would be what happens in the gait cycle, right? So if you're gait cycle training, if you're training to walk and run, that's what you would do, because that's the motion that happens as you walk and run. Now, I would stay within the columns, meaning that basically your hip and your knee, or sorry, your hip and your ankle should be in alignment pretty much all the time, whether that be you leaning forward because you're running or you're standing straight up. They're on top of each other, and they're two ball and socket, although the ankle is a little bit more complex. Let's pretend they're doing this on top of each other. So this is the ankle, this is the hip. They're both doing this, and in between the knee is being, moved from side to side, but it's not actually so much doing the rotation itself. It's going along for the ride. So you have to have the proper behavior at the hip and the ankle. The knee will thank you later. Okay. Now that is staying on the outside edge of your foot, inside ankle bone high. Finish with the with the heel away as you run. These are indicators that you're doing the outletting of the energy properly. Okay. I'd love to hear an argument. I'd love to debate somebody who says your heel should spin in as you go forward. I don't think anyone's going to take that position.
No, I don't think so.
Nobody wants to take the position other than GOATA that the heel goes out as you move. Even Weckmethod, even Naudi, they're not doing it. So props to GOATA for that, because I think they're correct. Prove me wrong.
And so so basically when you're talking about having your heel come away, the foot will come down onto the ground, spiral off the pinky toe edge, rotate off, and then the heel turns out as the hip internally rotates as you step.
It's a rotary system, okay? So it's actually not the toes that touch. The toes are there.
I'm just using it's more the side, right?
Yeah, but for the people listening, right? Imagine my hand is the foot. This is like, to me, I feel a boomerang come around. If my foot was the palm, it's coming in towards the the middle finger, and then I'm pivoting with my foot, and that's the heel turning away. So it hits the ground and it pivots like this. This is the flow here. Pretend that my wrist is the ankle bone. I want to keep that up high. Where the system now, the mainstream fitness knowledge, or I should say biomechanics knowledge, doesn't acknowledge that it's a pivot. It acknowledges only that it's a down system like this, and that the big toe coming off last is the windlass mechanism. Basically, your arch becoming like a dome and using that spring technology, or that spring to propel you, when GOATA saying, no, actually, it's the pivot point system. You still get the windlass mechanism off the plantar fascia, but it's not done off the big toe. It's done from a pivot point using the energy to flow like this. I picture a boomerang when I'm moving, coming off my foot, and that's what it feels like.
So the heel away, where does that pivot originate from? Because when I started doing it, I started internally rotating my leg, but then that didn't feel right. So I started twisting more from pivoting my hips from my spine more. That started to feel more natural. So is it an internal rotation or more from the hips?
There is internal rotation of the hip that happens because your foot is doing this motion here, that spiral type of motion. If you hit inside ankle bone high, if you're following the checklist, off the 4th and 5th metatarsal, really I'd say it's probably, you're pivoting off the 3rd or 2nd, ideally. Sometimes a dump in, that's fine, but for the most part, you want to keep that inside ankle bone high. You want to pivot around that fourth and fifth into that third metatarsal. I might be, you can debate me, go to people on that. And the heel will naturally turn away and the bones will go with it. The tibia and fibula will go and the femur will both internally rotate, and that's how you do it. If you try to do it from just your hip, you're missing half the picture, but at the start, you might have to do that. It's kind of like for me in boxing, when I teach it, I teach people to pivot overly dramatic so that I can be like, yeah, 2 weeks later, stop being so overly dramatic, now you got it, okay? So I think there's an element to that in teaching it, but in reality, if you step properly, you just feel it.
So for people who are listening, Will and I are recording this podcast on No Filter Network, which is a live interactive streaming platform where people can ask questions in the chat. They can hit a button to knock. So if they ever wanted to come on and have their biomechanics assessed by us live and to have little cues to how they could fix their movement patterning, that's always an option. So if you ever want to watch these podcasts live, go to www.nofilter.net. and go check out. We have a few people who are watching live right now, so if they have any questions, they can literally type them in the box or hit the knock button to join the stream and have their movement assessed, which is the coolest feature on here. And the reason that we want to do that is so that we're not just talking about movement, we're actually helping people move in real time, which is really sweet. I think another reason that we're doing this podcast too, and the reason that we're hammering so hard on the nuances of where your foot hits the fucking ground, is because if you master these biomechanical nuances, if the basic patterning of human movement, everything else becomes easier. You experience less pain in your body, you experience movement efficiency, it becomes easier to train for higher power output, higher cardiovascular output. At least that's been my experience. It's been the experience of a lot of other people who've trained in methods like GOATA, Weckmethod, etc. And we're really looking for, I think, a grand unified theory of movement rather than just ascribing to a singular system. We're just trying to figure out how the human body is meant to work. And then once we know that, how do we train it to be even better?
Absolutely. And for me, this is all up for discussion, debate, whatever, right? Like there's a lot of nuances to the points that we're saying, and we're working off almost a new paradigm. I would say GOATA is a new paradigm in movement. So there's going to be a lot of misinterpretation firing back and forth because the brain, if you asked me 5 years ago, I would come from the lens of functional movement being lifting. And I don't understand anything else. What are you talking about? It's like the cure is the barbell. Like, of course, right? So there's going to be a lot of misinterpretation, and that's fine. Ask questions, get it clarified. I'd love to clarify it. So and open for debate.
And that's the intention over time. We're gonna bring more and more movement methods into question. We're gonna look at more videos and break things down so that you can see them in more detail, so things make more sense. If you have topics that you want to hear covered, shoot us a message. You can find Will at the Art of Move on Instagram. You can also find me at media@nofilter.net if you want to send me a personal message. If you're watching this on Spotify, there will always be a question option where you can ask your own questions. You can give your own input. We have polls that you can answer. And as always, if you watch these on nofilter.net live, you'll be able to ask your questions live. You'll be able to knock into the room, etc. So in terms of a big takeaway from today's episode, we covered a lot of ground. We kind of talked about how, the barbell is a tool that was mostly used for strengthening muscles, and that the muscular system is one system of many within the body. To shift away from a traditional paradigm of training into a paradigm where you're focusing more on training specific patterns that honor the natural biomechanics of the human body, it does require a huge mental shift. And we covered a lot of the nuances of that mental shift and of the biomechanical shift away from, just trying to strengthen the muscle to trying to get your patterning correct. We talked about the spiral motion of the body, where the foot has to land and how it should pivot in order to have sort of a biomechanically sound gait. And so if you wanted people to walk away with one major aha moment, one major insight from all the things that we covered today, what would you say people should walk away with today?
looking at training in the way of intentionally training the patterns and the joints to move how nature designed them, not so much just lifting to make the muscle bigger. Your longevity depends on it. Do you want to move well when you're older? Do you want to be more athletic? So instead of training muscles and to get bigger, which will end at some point, you're training athleticism to increase, pain-free ranges of motion to increase, and you can eventually put muscle on it. Okay, so you'll get the best of both worlds, but you got to come back a little bit to the beginning and relearn the patterns that you once had literally as a baby. We can get into that, another time, but you're coming back to the pattern that you were designed with. Okay, so that's what I would say there.
All right, so in that case, next episode, Will and I are going to be covering some of those natural biomechanical patterns, what patterns you should be prioritizing in your training. If it isn't a hinge, if it isn't a squat or a lunge, if it isn't a press or a pull in those static positions that we normally train in these fixed plane of motions with a barbell, with cable machines, we're going to go over each one of those patterns and what we should prioritize learning.
And I want to say something. I've studied a lot of different systems, whether it be, through traditional schooling, chiropractic. I was in, kinesiology, did all that. Weckmethod, GOATA, functional patterns, FRC. I'm not certified in any of them except for Weckmethod. I'm certified in the RMT ropes and stuff. But basically, I've dove into all of them, like extremely. And I practice and I have my own practice to integrate those movements. So I have a lot of knowledge from different systems. So if you come from one of those systems, I'd love to dialogue with you, ask questions, debate, or even if you're just looking into those systems, I have your answers or likely close to your answer.
And that's like you said, looking at all these different systems, trying to find a grand unified theory of movement. That's the point of this podcast. That's the point of these discussions. And we don't want anything that we say to be viewed as gospel for movement. At least I don't. I want this to be getting people to think about their movement and their training and their bodies in a different way, in a way that is outside of the box of the sagittal plane, outside of the box of conventional training, and to realize that function means more than just being able to move through a range of motion well, to be able to lift barbells pain-free. Functional training essentially means to be able to move the way your body was meant to move. And we're having these discussions to try and figure that out and make it as clear as possible. So to everyone who listened live, thank you so much. We got Stephen Luker and we got Michelle in here who listened live. Thank you so much for tuning into the very first episode of the Art of Movement.
Any questions?
Yeah, drop any questions that you have. If you like this episode, just let us know on the chat. Feel free to knock if you want to have a little discussion with us here. This podcast will be available on Spotify and other major podcasting streams. But as always, the best experience that you're going to get with the Art of Move, especially if we have other guests on here that you want to ask specific questions to, is to go on www.nofilter.net and register for any upcoming live streams that we have. So we're going to leave the floor open for questions for a second, and then we'll wrap up. And I don't see if you guys wanted to knock, if you guys wanted to sign in, if you had any questions, feel free to let us know.
And I just wanted to say, with No Filter, the great thing is we didn't do it this episode, but because I had to switch computers, I had a bunch of tape ready to roll. So you can screen share, and I can show you exactly what I'm talking about in slow motion as we go along. So that'll be available in the upcoming episodes. Tune in to No Filter. It'll be the best experience, but you will still get a great experience with Spotify, Apple.
And I think we'll have clips too. If you are listening on Spotify or something, we can actually save the videos that we make on No Filter and we can edit them. So we'll probably have clips for reference on a YouTube channel, on our Instagram, just so that we can, if we ever do reference a video outside, you'll still be able to view the video externally, and we'll probably link to that later on in the episode. So Anyway, thanks to everyone who was listening to the first episode of The Art of Move. My name is Anthony Manuel. You were listening to me and Dr. Will Raybar from Banff, Alberta. We're pretty stoked to have done this.
Very stoked.
Michelle is saying no questions, but great info. Thanks. Thank you for
Thanks,
tuning
Michelle.
in, Michelle. It was super, super fun to do this. Will, I'm stoked for the next episode. We'll dive even deeper into the foundations of basically human movement and what patterns people can prioritize to start building a better foundation of movement for their training. So thanks again, guys. Check out nofilter.net for the next episode, and we'll see you next time.